The room was quiet, save for the hum of a desk fan that struggled to cut through the thick summer air. Ashlyn sat hunched over her textbooks, her mind juggling lesson plans and overdue assignments. Her world was one of survival, carved from relentless effort and nights spent chasing a dream that felt perpetually out of reach. She had grown used to the rhythm of it, the endless hustle of balancing part-time jobs with the heavy burden of student loans. Yet, in those stolen moments of stillness, a thought lingered. What if this struggle never ends? Her phone buzzed. A notification from Miriam. The name alone was enough to tighten her chest, to summon memories of sharp words and colder silences. Ashlyn didn't answer immediately. She never did when it came to Miriam. But curiosity, or perhaps a masochistic sense of duty, always got the better of her. The message was clear and simple. We need to talk. The weight of obligation can chain even the strongest souls. For Ashlyn, every interaction with Miriam was another link in a chain she hadn't yet figured out how to break. When the call finally came, it wasn't warmth that greeted her but a calculated cadence, the kind Miriam had perfected over years of veiled manipulation. The announcement of a wedding wasn't so much a joyous revelation as it was a directive, a command dressed in the frills of an invitation. The wedding would be in the Caribbean. A beautiful escape, Miriam had said, her words laced with promises of respite and support for Ashlyn's mounting tuition fees. But the undertones of control were unmistakable. In life, kindness offered without sincerity often bears the bitter aftertaste of obligation. Ashlyn had learned to taste the bitterness long before the sweetness ever reached her lips. When the plane touched down, the island unfolded like a postcard, vivid greens and blues that seemed almost too bright, too perfect to be real. Ashlyn stepped off the plane, the weight of her single, frayed suitcase a sharp contrast to the luxurious setting that awaited her. Miriam greeted her with a tight smile, the kind that stretched the skin but never reached the eyes. By her side stood Fiona, exuding the effortless confidence of someone who had never needed to fight for anything. And then there was Bruce, the man who would soon marry Miriam. His handshake was warm, his demeanor disarmingly kind, a stark contrast to Miriam's polished but distant effect. Beside him stood Noah, whose quiet curiosity seemed to mirror her own. First impressions are seldom the whole truth, yet they linger like shadows, shaping what comes next. The villa was a marvel, vast and opulent, with windows that opened to endless ocean views. But to Ashlyn, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. The walls echoed with laughter that didn't quite include her, with conversations that edged around her presence rather than embracing it. The first evening brought a game, favorite things, they called it, a charming tradition meant to break the ice. Yet, for Ashlyn, it was less an invitation and more an examination. When her turn came, she spoke hesitantly of a book she cherished, a story of resilience and quiet rebellion. Fiona's laughter came too quickly, sharp and dismissive, cutting through the fragile connection Ashlyn had tried to build. Isolation doesn't always come in silence. Sometimes, it's forged in moments when the world seems to shrink around you, leaving no space to belong. The days passed in a blur of orchestrated activities, each one designed to showcase the perfection of Miriam's carefully constructed life. But perfection, Ashlyn knew, was often just another mask. It was in the small moments that the cracks began to show. A lingering glance from Noah, a tension in Bruce's shoulders when Miriam wasn't looking, Fiona's veiled barbs that barely concealed her growing jealousy. At night, Ashlyn retreated to the small room tucked away from the grander parts of the villa. She would sit by the window, her eyes on the sea but her mind elsewhere. The waves were constant, their rhythm soothing yet unrelenting, a reminder of how small she felt in this world Miriam had crafted. Every paradise holds its secrets, and every ocean whispers truths that only the brave dare to hear. The real shift began one afternoon, during a moment of quiet stolen from the chaos. Noah found her by the garden, her books spread out as she tried to escape into her studies. He didn't speak much at first, just watched, his presence calm and unassuming. When he finally broke the silence, it wasn't with the usual small talk but with genuine curiosity. Their conversation meandered from literature to life, from dreams to fears. Noah listened in a way few people ever had, his interest unforced, his sincerity disarming. For the first time since her arrival, Ashlyn felt seen, not as a guest, not as an obligation, but as a person. Connection is often found in the unlikeliest of places, in moments that feel too fragile to last yet too profound to ignore. But even as this connection grew, so too did the tension. Fiona watched them from the shadows, her eyes narrowing, her smile tight. And Miriam, ever the puppet master, began to pull her strings more forcefully. The promise of tuition help was dangled like a carrot, but the cost was unspoken, a debt Ashlyn could already feel growing. Promises, like waves, can lift you momentarily, only to drag you under when you least expect it. By the end of that first act, Ashlyn stood at the precipice of something she couldn't yet name. The air was thick with unspoken words, the horizon both endless and constraining. She knew she was part of a game she hadn't agreed to play, a pawn in a story that wasn't hers to write. And yet, for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of something else, hope, perhaps, or the faintest outline of rebellion. In every story, there comes a moment when the tide begins to turn. For Ashlyn, that moment was drawing near, as inevitable as the sunrise, as unpredictable as the storm it would bring. The days in paradise began to shift, their shimmering allure giving way to an undercurrent of unease. For Ashlyn, the villa had become both a haven and a trap, a place where beauty masked bitterness, where every pleasantry seemed weighted with ulterior motives. The planning for Miriam's grand wedding intensified, an elaborate display of perfection that demanded compliance from everyone involved. Yet, in this quest for flawlessness, cracks were forming, subtle but undeniable. Beneath the surface of every well-rehearsed performance lies the truth, waiting to claw its way into the light. Fiona had taken charge of the details with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Her voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the villa as she dictated every aspect of the ceremony. Ashlyn watched from the sidelines, her presence tolerated but never welcomed. It was in these moments, amidst Fiona's orchestrations, that Ashlyn felt the weight of her own invisibility. To Miriam, she was a tool, a means to an end, a pawn in a game Ashlyn hadn't agreed to play. The debate over the release of doves during the ceremony became a microcosm of the power struggles within the family. Ashlyn, with her quiet practicality, dared to voice a concern, only to be silenced by Miriam's cold rebuke. For Miriam, dissent was unacceptable, a threat to the image she worked so tirelessly to maintain. Control is a fragile thing, easily threatened by even the softest whisper of defiance. The tension escalated during a visit to a nearby bird sanctuary. Ashlyn, drawn to the quiet beauty of the place, found solace in the company of Noah. Here, amidst the vibrant colors of the birds and the rustle of leaves, there was a reprieve from the weight of expectation. Noah's presence was steady, his interest in her genuine. Yet even in this fleeting moment of connection, Fiona's shadow loomed. She watched from a distance, her jealousy a palpable force that tainted the air. Miriam's warning came later, sharp and cutting. She reminded Ashlyn of her place, of the precarious balance that kept her tethered to Miriam's promises. Any illusion of freedom Ashlyn had entertained was swiftly shattered, replaced by the suffocating realization of her dependence. Freedom often exists only in the imagination of the oppressed, a fragile hope that crumbles under the weight of reality. That evening, by the pool, Bruce sought out Ashlyn. His voice carried a warmth that contrasted with Miriam's frosty demeanor, and his words were laced with something Ashlyn hadn't expected: concern. He spoke of Miriam's struggles, her life as a widow, and the sacrifices she claimed to have made for her children. Yet as he spoke, Ashlyn couldn't shake the feeling that his kindness was tinged with doubt, a faint but growing suspicion that Miriam's version of events was far from complete. Trust is a fragile bridge, built on stories we choose to believe. But when the foundation is shaken, even the strongest bridge can collapse. The following days brought a series of moments that deepened the chasm between Ashlyn and the rest of the family. At a local bakery, the sweet aroma of cakes and pastries became the backdrop for a quiet but significant connection between Ashlyn and Noah. As they discussed flavors and preferences, their shared laughter cut through the tension, creating a fleeting but precious bond. Fiona's disdain, however, was never far behind, her sharp words aimed to wound. A fishing trip added another layer to the unfolding drama. Out on the open water, Ashlyn surprised everyone with her skill, reeling in a fish far larger than anyone expected. It was a moment of triumph, a rare instance where she felt seen for her capabilities rather than her shortcomings. But the day took a darker turn when Jerry, overwhelmed by the motion of the sea and the weight of his own secrets, faltered. His vulnerability was raw, unguarded, and in its wake, the veneer of control that Miriam and her family clung to began to crack. In moments of weakness, the truth often reveals itself, not in words, but in the silence that follows. The tension reached a breaking point during the bridal fitting. Miriam, draped in ivory silk and pearls, stood as a vision of perfection. Yet her beauty was marred by the sharpness of her tongue, her dismissive remarks directed at Ashlyn cutting deeper than any fabric could. Fiona, ever the opportunist, seized the moment to sow further discord. With a calculated smile, she let slip the existence of a hidden bank account, emptied by Jerry's gambling debts. The revelation was a grenade tossed into an already volatile situation, its implications reverberating through the room. Secrets, once revealed, have a way of rewriting the story. They demand to be reckoned with, no matter the cost. Later that evening, Noah found Ashlyn once again. This time, it was her quiet determination that drew him in, the way she poured herself into her studies despite the chaos around her. He offered her an escape, a momentary reprieve from the storm. Together, they ventured beyond the confines of the villa, their shared laughter and whispered confidences a balm for the wounds inflicted by the day. But even in these moments of light, darkness lingered. Fiona, driven by jealousy and a need to assert control, confronted Ashlyn with the full weight of her resentment. She revealed Jerry's debts in brutal detail, her words dripping with malice. The confrontation left Ashlyn reeling, the weight of the family's dysfunction threatening to drown her. When the truth emerges, it often does so violently, shattering illusions and leaving only fragments behind. By the end of the act, the villa's once idyllic atmosphere had become a battlefield. Alliances were forming, secrets were unraveling, and the stakes were rising. For Ashlyn, the question was no longer whether she could endure, but whether she could escape unscathed. In every storm, there comes a moment when survival depends not on weathering the winds, but on choosing to stand and face them head-on. The storm that had been brewing beneath the surface finally broke. The air inside the villa was thick, oppressive, charged with the weight of too many secrets. Ashlyn could feel it pressing against her, a suffocating reminder of her precarious position in this carefully curated chaos. Miriam, the architect of it all, stood at the center of the storm, her polished veneer beginning to crack under the strain. Every lie demands its toll, and for Miriam, the bill had come due. The morning began with a humiliation that felt calculated, almost surgical in its precision. Ashlyn, lacking the wardrobe deemed appropriate for the occasion, became the target of Miriam's barbed words. The excuse of her financial constraints was no shield against Miriam's disdain, and the pointed remarks stung like tiny, deliberate cuts. Yet Ashlyn did not crumble. Her silence in the face of ridicule was not born of submission but of a simmering defiance, a quiet resistance that was growing harder to suppress. When the confrontation finally erupted, it was like a dam breaking. Ashlyn, tired of being used, stood her ground. She called out the injustice, the manipulation, the lies that Miriam had woven into every corner of their relationship. The mention of her tuition, the promise that had been dangled like a lifeline only to become a chain, was the final blow. Miriam, caught off guard by Ashlyn's sudden boldness, faltered. But her retreat was temporary, a brief pause in a battle that was far from over. There comes a moment in every fight where one must choose, to retreat, to strike, or to endure. Ashlyn's choice was clear, she would not retreat. Later, Noah intervened, offering Ashlyn not just solace but a chance to reclaim some semblance of dignity. The trip into town was more than a simple errand, it was a reprieve, a chance to escape the villa's oppressive atmosphere and breathe freely, even if only for a moment. In the quiet intimacy of a boutique, amidst the laughter and simplicity of choosing a dress, something shifted. The bond between Ashlyn and Noah, fragile yet undeniable, began to solidify. But even this brief escape was not without its shadows. Fiona's influence lingered, her whispered insinuations threatening to taint whatever happiness Ashlyn allowed herself to feel. Back at the villa, the tension reached a boiling point. Noah, emboldened by his growing feelings for Ashlyn, confronted Bruce about the disparity in their treatment of her. His words were sharp, cutting through the polite facade that Bruce had maintained for far too long. Miriam attempted to deflect, her explanations slick and practiced, but the doubt in Bruce's eyes was unmistakable. The carefully constructed narrative Miriam had relied on was beginning to unravel, piece by piece. When the truth begins to surface, no amount of denial can keep it submerged. It demands to be acknowledged, no matter the cost. And then came the revelation that shattered whatever fragile piece remained. The truth about Jerry's gambling debts, about the money siphoned away to feed his addiction, emerged like a tidal wave. Miriam's duplicity, her willingness to manipulate and deceive to protect her image, was laid bare. Bruce, faced with the full weight of her betrayal, could no longer look at her the same way. The trust between them, already tenuous, crumbled beneath the weight of her lies. For Ashlyn, the moment was bittersweet. To see Miriam's downfall was vindicating, but it came at a cost. The villa, once a symbol of opulence and escape, now felt like a prison. The weight of Miriam's deceit and the toxic dynamics of her family were too much to bear. Ashlyn made her decision. She would leave, not out of defeat, but as an act of self-preservation. At the airport, the final confrontation between Ashlyn and Noah played out against the backdrop of departure. Noah, unwilling to let her go without a fight, laid bare his feelings. His words, raw and unfiltered, spoke to a depth of emotion that Ashlyn had not allowed herself to hope for. It was not a plea, but a declaration, an invitation to choose something more than survival. Love, when it comes, often feels like a risk too great to take. But for those brave enough to embrace it, it can be the only anchor in a storm. Ashlyn's choice to stay was not born of weakness, but of strength. She chose not just Noah, but herself, to stand firm in the face of everything that had tried to diminish her. Together, they returned to the villa, not as pawns in Miriam's game, but as something greater, something unbroken. For Miriam, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Bruce, armed with the full truth, ended their engagement. The confrontation was brutal, a reckoning that Miriam could not escape. She tried to justify, to explain, but her words carried no weight. Her children, too, faced the consequences of their actions. Fiona's jealousy and manipulation, Jerry's recklessness, they were not spared from the fallout. In the end, every action has its consequence, every choice its price. For Miriam and her children, the cost was everything they had tried so desperately to hold on to. As Miriam and her family departed, the villa transformed. The weight of their presence lifted, leaving behind a space that felt lighter, freer. Ashlyn, Noah, and Bruce chose to stay, to reclaim the beauty of the place and fill it with something genuine. Together, they toasted to new beginnings, their laughter mingling with the sound of waves. And when Noah took Ashlyn's hand, his declaration of love was not just a promise to her, but a vow to himself, to build something real, something untainted by the shadows of the past. Every ending holds the seeds of a beginning. For Ashlyn, Noah, and Bruce, this was not the end of the story but the start of a chapter unburdened by lies, filled instead with hope and possibility.